Hey, all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is a memoir by April Balascio called Raised by a Serial Killer, Discovering the Truth About My Father. I vaguely remember the name Edward Wayne Edwards, and that one author claimed Edwards was the most prolific serial killer ever. Otherwise, I knew little about the case. Edward Wayne Edwards was April Balaccio's dad. Her memoir focuses on her childhood, her life with her dad, the good, the tragic, the abuse, and the torment of growing up with a serial killer for a father. I'm not going to belabor the main plot points simply because there was a podcast and a documentary and someone else wrote an exhaustive biography of Edward Wayne Edwards. If you want all the details of Edward's murders, you can research it for yourself. Let me start by saying I'm solely judging the book based on narrative choices and style of writing, and it is no reflection whatsoever of any of the experiences that Balascio wrote about in her book. Because Balaccio's story is one that needed telling, not just for herself, but for the victims and also for the greater good. You hope psychologists, detectives, and those in the courts would read such true accounts to better understand the makings of a serial killer, the familial behaviors of a serial killer, and how serial killers do hide in plain sight. Balaccio's short introduction brings about the horror of realizing her father is a very bad man, while also trying to reconnoiter that he was at times a good father. According to her, he was the center of her universe. She's debating about calling a hotline for a cold case where two young people were murdered in one of the many towns she lived in throughout her childhood. Let me read you the end of it, when she's got 1,000 questions running through her head, as I'm sure anyone in her position would. The events of my childhood eroded that adoration, but even still, he never ceased to be the center of my universe, even as I tried to get out from under his control. And so when I tell you that it was me who pointed the finger at my father, who spoke the words that I knew in the end could bring him down, it is with profound sorrow, grief, and no sense of peace. What peace can be found in forcing the answer to the unbearable question? Was my own father more than a bad man? He had hurt people. I had witnessed that. But was I right to think that he may have gone further? Did all my memories of our leaving towns and schools and friends without saying goodbye qualify as evidence? Was there any truth to my growing suspicions that he may have been a killer? Was the man who cradled me in his arms when I was a young child a monster? What is it that I seek in telling my story? Is it absolution, redemption, forgiveness? I don't yet know the answer, but if others find even a little bit of closure in their own lives, then my journey will have been worthwhile. So I can't even imagine her horror and the decision she had to make. The beginning for me was a bit slow. Balascio really begins from the beginning with her earliest childhood memories. It took me a bit to get into it simply because I felt I didn't have much context to go on other than the obvious premise of the book. After about the first 30 pages, then I was deep enough into the book that I couldn't put it down. Balaccio's book is essentially chronological order in relation to her experiences growing up. These chapters then are broken up by the life of her father, what he lived before she was born. I liked her choice of flip-flopping these timelines. Then her final part of the book is her uncovering of her father's murders through police reports and such. That narrative choice didn't work as well for me, but I'll get to that later. Balascio captures the adoration she felt for her father in those early years. We see it through a child's eyes, and Balascio does an excellent job at revealing those snapshots of early memories, the kind we all have when we're that little, that are very piecemeal and fragmented. As the story progresses, we see how abusive her father is, the terror she and her four younger siblings dealt with on a daily basis, yet also some of the fun stuff, the typical stuff that become fond memories as we age. This was, I thought, one of the most compelling aspects of her story. Her father was a serial killer, yet she is showing her readers that he was what he was like as a father on his good days, and she loved him in her younger years. That would be very difficult to relay, even to yourself, much less to readers. So Balascio does an excellent job in painting a full picture of her father. And let's face it, John Wayne Gacy was a community leader and looked up to. Women swooned over Ted Bundy. Humans, including serial killers, are very complex. No matter how evil, we cannot reduce them to simplistic characteristics. Balaccio's memoir reminds us all of that. which is all the more terrifying when you really sit and think about it. It would be easier if evil never presented itself with any sort of redeeming qualities, many of which are manipulated so that the serial killer gets what he wants, but the unsuspecting general public aren't aware of such psychopathy. Balascio takes her reader along each childhood home, and they move a lot. As she ages, she questions why they left so abruptly and how things don't always add up. One home burns down, but somehow all their toys were saved. The story becomes much more difficult to read as she reaches puberty and how she tried to find sanctuaries away from home. She learned some excellent life skills from her father, home repairs, how to be the best-selling Girl Scout cookie ever, but also to fear her father. She no longer runs to the door to greet him when he gets home, but rather hides out in her room or some other place on their property, avoiding him as much as possible. She writes about the relief of having him in jail and how life was so much better without him, only to have him return home when she's only a couple of years left of high school. She describes her father's charismatic personality, how even though he handed out a memoir he wrote that bragged about his violence and jail time, people still thought he was great. Even the horrible pranks that he subjected his children to, many of them party tricks, people loved it. He was a blowhard and a showman, and people fell for it. One aspect of the book that I don't think Balascio developed as well as she should have was her mother, her very submissive mother. While Balascio tries to relate to her mother at times or tries to understand her mother's choices or lack thereof, there's no arc within that relationship. I have little understanding even of what her mom thought of anything once Balascio is an adult. While Balascio mentions her adult siblings and how they didn't want her to contact police, very little is written about her mother, especially regarding their relationship now. Part 3 of the book is where things fell apart for me a little bit. This is where Balascio recounts her findings about what her father did as she talks to detectives and reads through police reports. At times it became repetitive and disjointed. I just think there could have been a better narrative structure to the book, maybe integrated such stuff into her own story. I couldn't follow all the names and places, and some of the repetition of information got old. I just didn't agree with that narrative choice made in this sections. But I had no idea that Scott Peterson's lawyer contacted Balascio, thinking Edwards could have been the murderer of Lacey Peterson, and how easily people buy into the gruesomeness of serial killers and are ready to believe that these popular serial killers are responsible for unsolved murders. Even JonBenet Ramsey came up in the book. It's this third part of the book that I have so many questions about, because even Balaccio's own story seems cut off at points. Her marriage falls apart and such, that there were so many storylines that didn't always come together for me. Yet, in her childhood scenes, Balascio has details that maybe readers don't always need to know. This is that kill your darlings part of writing that is very difficult to do. Some parts felt like they were written for her to document everything she remembered, not for the sake of the reader and the story they were reading. She also uses lots of cliches at times that became a bit tiresome. But here's the thing. Her story was compelling and definitely worthy of writing and having readers read her finished book. I can only imagine how difficult it was for her to write the book and how much of her own emotional journey she suffered as she uncovered new information about her father. If you are familiar with Edward Wayne Edwards and the murders he committed, you will want to read this book. If you experienced your own childhood trauma, Balaccio's story might help you, as she does an excellent job at showing all of those confusing layers of our childhood and how relationships with our parents are complicated, and in Balaccio's case, very complicated with a serial killer as a father. She seeks to understand her own childhood, and in doing so, bestows upon her readers the gift of compassion and empathy, which I think we all need a little bit more of right now. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.